Okay, so welcome back to part two of this blood gas analysis, or at least the way I go through it. It's just more a matter of how we approach the numbers as opposed to any in-depth science about any of this stuff. So just to refresh, this person had a drowning experience, pH of 6.96, an elevated CO2. They were probably in the process of getting intubated and or ventilated and so on at this point, but an elevated CO2, but not enough to cause that pH. And certainly the very negative base excess says they have well, what we were taught back in the days, a metabolic, but I always want to consider the metabolic acids directly and the electrolytes when we look at this in detail. So we're going to look at the numbers below the standard that we were taught back when I studied and what a lot of my students learn. So, starting at the very bottom, which will be the lactate. And a lactate of 14 is very high. The normal range is less than 2, and I have a vague memory of lactic threshold training being running people to a lactate of 4, and most of them feel like vomiting the whole time. And as you can see, a lot of these other numbers are also outside of range, which is something we'll consider. So I'm not going to go into the Krebs cycle or aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, but if you want to look that up, a good friend of mine actually, Armando, who I've worked with, you can find him on YouTube and he does some excellent work, and I'll put a link to his this talk below, so follow and look along with him. The button, well, I use these as analogies. I guess what I want you to think about is how you can relate this to something you know and something you feel, as opposed to, the very deep chemistry and physiology of all of this. So the way to approach lactic acid is that it is caused by anaerobic metabolism, the burning of glucose without oxygen for various reasons. Either you're doing more work than you're delivering oxygen for, or you're not delivering enough oxygen from some central reason or ventilation reason, or you're high up a mountain somewhere. Any of those reasons that you're lacking oxygen delivery. So the running up the hill analogy is that you'll feel a cramp, you'll feel a burn, I should say, and if you keep running, that might result in a cramp. Now, I'm not saying the lactic acid directly causes the burning sensation. It's probably a lot to do with electrolytes, but back to the point I want to say, this is an electrolyte issue, not just a metabolic acid issue. So the burning, in my head, I think about as potassium being extracellular, and potassium definitely creates a burning sensation when it gets infused into patients. So that's part of a very complex problem. So think about a cramp as a depolarization and a contraction you didn't ask for. So if it's in your calf muscle from running up a hill, it's your standard kind of crampy feeling. But if a depolarization you didn't ask for occurs in your ventricle, then it's going to be ventricular fibrillation. And another simple analogy to think of is a depolarization you didn't ask for in your brain would be a seizure type activity. Because of the way certainly heart muscle and neurons connect, that anything that depolarizes sets off a wave around it. So that's where I'm not saying the analogy is perfect, but the idea that any small issue and local issue can become a widespread issue. And then when the organ runs out of energy, the heart, I guess, stops, and that's asystole. And when the brain section in question stops, then that's your hemiparesis in stroke kind of idea. So a lack of oxygen creates a situation where you have an incomplete burn of glucose, resulting in lactic acid, which of itself is, an acid, but it's not a strong acid. But the problem is you only make a much smaller percentage of ATP from that incomplete burn as you would a full breakdown of glucose down to CO2. The electrolytes I want to touch on briefly. Now these are all out of whack and they're all a bit high. And one way we approach this that I was taught back in the day by one of the ICU bosses was strong ion difference. And I'll go through a little bit of what that looks like here. So if you just take the averages of 136 to 146, that's 141, and sodium's a positive ion, so that's a plus. The average of the potassium is a 4, and the average of the chloride is 105, but that is a negative ion. So 141 plus 4 is 145, minus 105 gives you a usual strong ion difference of plus 40. Now that means you have 40 extra sodiums in water than you do chlorides, and sodium in water forms sodium hydroxide, which is a strong alkali. And if you want to think about that in terms of the pH effect, if you have neutral water, it has a pH of 7, and if you have more sodium in that water, then that sodium creates an alkali, which is part of our reason that we live at a pH of above 7, or what you'd expect for water at standard temperature and pressure. Again, it's just sodium is an alkali metal and alkali forming. And this person's strong ion difference is, if you add those up, the pluses and the minuses, 37. Now how do we relate these two numbers? Well, to get from 40 to 37, that is minus 3. That minus 3, just remember for now, and we'll come back to it later. So, the sodium, potassium, chloride are out of whack, also calcium, glucose. So glucose is going to be one of the other reasons for a metabolic acidosis, and the concept to remember is diabetic ketoacidosis, in the sense of when you don't have enough insulin, the glucose stays in your blood, and if the glucose is in your blood, it's not going into your muscles, and instead of burning glucose, they will burn fats, and the remnant is not a clean burn of CO2 and water, but something called ketones. And ketones in water are acidic, diabetic ketoacidosis. And you can see here he has a high glucose, not crazy high, but certainly high enough that you could consider that some of his metabolism is fat burning. And part of the reason the glucose is high in the blood is it's not getting transported in for electrolyte reasons, but also you need some ATP in order to do the glycolysis kind of parts of it to get the beginnings before the Krebs cycle. So to go through this from the top, 6.966 is close to 6.7, and 6.7 will of itself create the situation of ventricular fibrillation. An elevated CO2 means you are lacking in minute ventilation, a low minute ventilation, so a ventilation problem requires a ventilation solution. I'm not going to worry about the oxygen in this instance because it's venous. The low bicarb in this instance is a result of having other metabolic or electrolyte acids pushing the bicarb back towards carbonic acid, and effectively that buffering idea is you're just raising the amount of CO2 by having less bicarb in the blood. The base excess being very negative at minus 15 is probably in large part because of the lactic acid, because that is a very similar number in millimoles, but also to some degree the glucose and the situation of ketones, and the electrolytes are slightly out of whack, but the net effect of that difference is only minus 3. So up to minus 3 of that minus 14 is because of an electrolyte imbalance. So that's the fair idea of what I look at and how we go through bloods, and we want to put that into systems, the ventilation perfusion, and then you start thinking about electrolytes and kidneys and things, and then again lactic acid. I start thinking about the muscles as an organ and muscle damage and muscle failure, because as physios we want to get people up and moving, and you certainly don't want to mobilize somebody that's already in a lactic acidosis and exceeding their threshold of what they can cope with. Anyway, thank you. Please like, subscribe, comment below on any other content you'd like to hear.